If you're a rugby player or any athlete for that matter that wants to dominate on the pitch, then developing lower body isn't optional, it is essential. Strength is the mother of all qualities, and the 10 movement patterns that I'm going to outline in this video today of what we've used with our athletes to get them from barely squatting the bar to hitting double body weight in 2 to 3 years, and that strength is what sets the standard for their performance. Let's get into it. So the 10 key movement patterns that we're going to be looking at are split into 3 tiers of exercises. You've got tier 1, and these are going to be your primary KPI drivers. These are going to be the ones responsible for our performance, and they're going to be in your program year round. We've then got our tier 2 exercises. These are going to be picked and rotated in and out of your program based on the weak areas that we have in our tier 1 exercises. Then we've got our tier 3 exercises, which are going to be our robustness work that we're going to pick based on the athlete, the time of year, and the issues that you are currently dealing with. So let's go into each exercise and where they slot, so you've got an understanding how to build your lower body program. So the first movement pattern that we have in our tier 1 series is going to be the bilateral squat pattern, and we're going to be looking at the back squat or the front squat. The reason why we pick these exercises here is they allow us to lift heavy loads through a large range of motion, which is why we get so much performance gain from a strength, speed and power standpoint from these exercises. So the second movement pattern in our tier 1 series is going to be the hinge pattern, and this way the squat and the hinge allow us to target the hips through the biggest range of motion. The squat allows us to travel vertically, whereas the hinge forces us to travel horizontally. So having these two in are going to be the biggest rocks for lower body performance. So using both the squat and the hinge when it comes to your tier 1 series can be done in one of 3 ways. You can do it in your typical standard way, where you pick the back squat, the front squat, the deadlift, and load those with your conventional strength rep ranges. This is what you will do the majority of the time, but you will also have the option of underloading or overloading the movement pattern. Overloading the movement pattern is going to be super useful when we want to bring about more intensity to that movement, aka weight on the bar. So things like box squats, trap bar deadlifts, block pulls, pin squats are going to be super useful in phases where we want to try and gear our adaptation more towards strength and power, because we can target specific joint ranges of motion and produce high amounts of force, making it very, very conducive to speed and power benefits as well as strength. On the flip side, we can find ways to underload the movement pattern, which is going to allow us to bring the amount of fatigue down from our lifts. We can do things like slow eccentrics, larger ranges of motion on all the squat and hinge patterns, which are going to allow us to build more time under tension and allow us to ingrain that movement pattern a little bit more. Slowing the movement pattern down allows our brain to process that pattern and find the right shapes, which is super useful for people that are in early phases of training where we're just trying to build and accumulate more work capacity. And they're kind of the 2 big ways that we will utilize our primary KPI exercise to get the most out of them. So the third and final pattern that goes into our tier 1 series is going to be our Olympic lifts. Now, I know what you may be thinking: speed, plyos, jumps, all those things are in tier 1, but this checklist is specifically for lower body strength training, and we would categorize those under speed and power, and we will be doing a full video on this of what you need to include when it comes to those sessions to get the most out of them. But the reason why we use Olympic lifts and why they're in tier 1 for me, they may not be for you and they're not for some coaches, is the variety of benefits that you will get from using them. Yes, it will train you to move weight fast. You will get that power element, but there's also a few subjective things that we look at when it comes to the weight lifts that make it super valuable for athletes. The first one being, you need to be able to learn to drop your center of mass quickly to gain better leverage over an external body mass. Think of when someone's running at you in a tackle. You need to drop your body height to put power in. That's exactly what we do on a clean. It is a skill in itself. You then also need to absorb forces in a wide range of movement patterns. You can power clean, you can fall clean. There's so many different ways that we can use them that make them super valuable for athletes. And the final thing is, normally those end ranges where you need to absorb force are going to build robustness. Think things like a snatch where you're locked in and your shoulders are traveling at end ranges of motion. The speed that you need to absorb the forces at in that overhead position make them super valuable for rugby players, and why we consider those a tier 1 movement pattern. That is going to be your cleans, that is going to be your snatches, that is going gonna be the weightlifting derivatives of those movements. Don't neglect those. So now we're moving on to the tier 2 exercises, and we're gonna be looking at these patterns to be used sparingly and rotated throughout the training year based on the weakness that we have in our KPI lift, okay? Now the first exercise pattern that we're going to be looking at is going to be the split squat and the lunge. We call this our unilateral squatting strength, and we will pick these based on where we need to strengthen throughout our full squat. For example, we could use something like a short range split squat to really promote that knee over our toe, getting into ankle dorsiflexion and loading up that quad. If we wanted to strengthen our front squat movement pattern, we could also swap this for a reverse lunge where we take a long step, where we're getting a nice vertical shin to load into those hips a little bit more if we're trying to strengthen up our deadlift and build some bigger glutes. So these exercises, like I said, can be, and the variations are endless. You just need to get creative on what part of the movement pattern that you're struggling and what joint angles you need to train to not make that a thing of the past. So movement pattern number 5 that you need to have a strong and dominant lower body is going to be some form of knee flexion exercise. Now this is going to be training the hamstring specifically, and what you need to realize is the hamstrings are a biarthrodial muscle, which means they cover 2 joints. They cover the hip and they cover the knee. And while yes, you are going to train your hamstrings in something like a hinge, you normally train them from the hip. So it's vital that we have a knee flexion exercise in there to train them from the knee. Now the perfect example of these are going to be your leg curl, where you can jump on and you can just simply take your heel to your hamstring. That way you're going to be shortening the hamstring at the knee and loading into those hamstrings. So when it comes to the knee flexion exercise, you want to actually train them in a variety of different hip positions. It's why you will rotate the seated hamstring curl, the lying hamstring curl, and the standing and kneeling hamstring curls to target the hamstring in the phase of sprinting that you probably need it most, and where it's going to translate over to improving those primary KPI exercises. So remember that, don't just sit on one, use a variety of different ways to train the hamstrings at different hip positions. So the next movement pattern that we have is the hip extension, and these are going to be tier 2 exercises. The reason why we like to include these here is, while yes, you are extending the hips in a hinge, you're extending the hips through the mid range of motion. And what you need to realize is that we want to try and target muscles at shortened ranges, lengthened ranges, and mid ranges. So we want to make sure that our hip extension exercises complement the strength profile that we're going to be looking to train. So something like a reverse hyper is going to train those glutes in the shortened range of motion. And then something like a seated cable good morning is going to train your glutes in the lengthened range of motion. Right here is where you're going to feel the most stretch and the most tension as the movement gets progressively easier as we stand up. That way, including those hip extension exercises in there, allow us to build a balanced strength profile and overall athletic performance. So the final exercise making up our tier 2 movement patterns for the lower body is actually going to be a knee extension exercise where we're looking to target the quads. Now the reason why these are in a tier 2 pattern as opposed to a tier 3 is because I see knee flexion and extension that is lacking in the majority of rugby athletes programs. You look at how rugby players squat, they are very, very hip dominant. They don't travel through large ranges of motion, and it's normally because of poor ankle mobility, overloaded technique in the shortened range, which means that they actually just lack in that range and they can't get there. So sticking them on a leg extension and actually just loading into that pattern, it's going to give the quads a stimulus that they never have before because it's just not in the program, which is why it's a tier 2 exercise. And I know what you may be thinking, machines aren't functional as an athlete. Yes, they are. Machines allow you to target ranges of motion and isolate those in a way that barbell compound lifts can't. So the functional thing on a rugby pitch is being able to display your strength through as many movement patterns as possible. And if knee extension is one of those that's lacking, well, guess what? The leg extension is going to be perfect for you. Now, the third tier of exercises are what we call our robustness work. These do not need a lot of love, purely because they are trained so readily through the variety of different other movement patterns that we've got. But the first on the list is going to be some calf work. You're going to want to get into ankle dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, what I'm doing at the calf here. We want to make sure that we're loading this, especially if you've had ongoing calf issues like I have. So you want to do a seated variation and you want to do a standing variation. But remember, the soleus has 8 to 9 times body weight going through it when we're sprinting. So load these movements up if they are in your program. They're not just something to do 3 sets of 15 with at body weight. Calves respond to training like any other muscle. They need progressive overload, and that doesn't happen with your body weight for 15 reps for the past 5 years, as I found out. So the next movement pattern on our tier 3 list is going to be anything that targets the hips outside the sagittal plane. Things like squats, hinges, all target the hips in that sagittal plane. What we want to look at is trying to challenge our hips through rotation with things like a hip aeroplane where we're targeting that lateral hip, and then things in the frontal plane where we're looking to target things like the adductors with a Copenhagen plank. This way you can build strong and robust hips that can work through all planes of motion. So the final movement pattern and what rounds out the tier 3 list and all of the tiers for that matter is going to be any form of trunk training. Now, I was always under the impression that you didn't necessarily need to train your core, because when you're squatting, when you're deadlifting, when you're doing those tier 1 exercises, you are targeting that core. And while that is true, you need to realize the abs, like the calves, function like any other muscle. They function through large ranges of motion with progressive overload. So we need to include some form of ab and core work. Maybe in the flexion pattern, we can do things like side bends to work that lateral flexion, and things like rotation where we're throwing med balls to work through rotation. That way you're going to develop a sound core, and you can do that isometrically. You can do that concentrically. You can do that eccentrically. You don't need to just build core endurance where your spine is stuck in one place, because you will move like that. We need to make sure that we can move through the hips, move through the ribs, move through the spine, and that is what your core training is for. That rounds out the tier list. Let's do a little bit of a recap. Tier 1, they're going to be your primary KPI drivers and the main things responsible for performance. Tier 2 are going to be the exercises that assist improving the tier 1 exercise, and the tier 3 exercises are going to be the things that keep you robust for the season and to do as much as you need as these two to progress. Catch you in the next one. Peace.